Today we're going to be talking about Tox files in TouchDesigner. We'll cover what these files are, how to use them, and why they're important. Before we talk about Tox files, though, let's first talk about TOW files. A TOW file is a project in TouchDesigner. It's what you get when you hit Ctrl+S or use the File menu to save a project. When you open a TOW file, a new instance of TouchDesigner opens and the project is loaded. Fun fact, TOW stands for Touch Environment. By default, everything in your network is going to be saved in that one file. The main exception for that are things like movie file intops that reference external images or other things like that. Even in that case, though, if you lock the operator, all of that image data gets saved in the project file itself. Another fun fact, locked operators are a great way to make your project files huge if for some reason you were to want that. So now we get to actual Tox files. Tox files are a way to take a single component in a project and save it out to a separate file. Fun fact, I have no idea what the X in Tox stands for, total mystery. In TouchDesigner, you can right-click any component and choose Save Component Tox. It'll ask you where you want to save that file. And then it will write out the contents of that component into a Tox file. It's going to include any operators inside of that component, as well as any custom parameters you might have set up, or even the values of built-in parameters depending on how things are set up. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. In the same project or even a totally different project, you can drag that file into a network and it's going to create a component with the same contents and the same parameters and stuff. Aside from copying and pasting from one running instance of Touch to another, this is really the only way to transfer components from one project to another. If you try to drag a TOW file into a network, it's not going to do anything, and you're even going to get a little warning in the status bar saying that type of file isn't supported. So Tox files really are the only way to get components into a project like that. So now let's get into a little bit more detail about loading Tox files and how that works. So what we've done so far is to drag a file in from Windows Explorer or Finder on Mac, drag that into a network, and it will create a new component with the contents from that file. When you do that, on the common parameter page, there is this external Tox path parameter, and TouchDesigner will automatically set that and make sure that that points to whatever the file was that you dragged in. It does this using an expression, and this file folder thing is a little bit more complicated of a topic that I might cover in a separate video, but general idea is that this points to wherever the file was that I dragged in there. But it also, by default, when you drag in, it will switch off this enable Tox parameter. And what that means is that Touch knows where this component came from, but it won't try to load it from that file by default. So if you save this project, it's going to save, the contents of this component and everything inside it in the project itself. And then when you load the project again, it's just going to use what it was saved in the project file, and it's not even going to try to look at that Tox file. In fact, it won't even notice if the Tox file that it's referring to doesn't exist. So, you change this to add something to it. It's not even going to complain about that fact, because even though it's kind of keeping track of what file it thinks is associated, it's not actually using it yet. If you want to manually load the contents of that file, there's this reload button next to enabled external Tox, and you can click that and it'll load the contents of the file. When you do that, if the file is missing, then you're going to get this warning. But if the file does exist, we reset this here and then do it again. It will successfully load, although the network editor sometimes doesn't clear that warning when it should. So quick way to do that is just toggle cooking on that component. If you want that file to be loaded automatically, like when the project loads, you can switch on this enable Tox parameter here. Just by switching that parameter on, it's not going to automatically load the contents of the file like right then, but the next time the project loads, it will load the contents from that file. There is also this save backup of external parameter here, which is on by default. And what that does is it will save the contents of this component in the project file, just like it would any regular component in a file. And when the project loads, it will try to load from the Tox, but if it can't, like if a file is missing, then it will load the one that's included in the backup. If this setting is off and you try to load the project and that file is missing, then you're going to end up with an empty component. It will probably still have any like custom parameters that you have on the component, although this gets into one of those areas where things are a little bit murky and confusing in TouchDesigner. But fortunately, that's only an issue if the file's missing. I usually keep that setting off, and that's particularly in cases where I know that I can assume that that file should be there anytime the project's loaded, because it makes the project file a little bit smaller since it doesn't have to save a copy of the whole component in the project file itself. It just kind of points to that separate Tox file. And it also helps to make it kind of clear when that file really is supposed to be there. And if it's missing, that means that like there's something very wrong and there's probably other stuff missing and you want, it to show a warning in that case. Otherwise, you can leave it on. And if you forget to copy that file, if you're, moving that project from one computer to another or something, or giving it to somebody else, then it'll still load even if that file is missing. There are also two parameters here that control how parameters are handled when a Tox file is loaded. So the first one here controls whether the contents of any custom parameters get loaded from the file. So in this case, this value of, if we set it to something like that, if that setting is on and we load this project, even if we've saved this project after making this change, when that Tox loads, it's going to wipe out the contents of the multiply parameter and just set it to whatever was in it when that file was saved. Otherwise, any parameters there will keep their state when the project loads, just like the contents of the component will load. It's worth noting, though, that I think any like definitions of custom parameters that you have on the component do actually get loaded from the file. So in the case where you like added a new parameter or deleted one or something, and you load the Tox, like that new definition will come in and like any parameters that were added after that file was saved will get wiped out. But that's also another one of those areas where things get a little bit weird and you're getting into kind of like edge case behavior in TouchDesigner, where general approaches just kind of try to avoid that situation in the first place. There is also an equivalent parameter for built-in parameters. So that's basically like anything in this top row of pages, and that includes all of these settings too. When either or both of those settings are on, you can end up with some kind of mysterious situations where like you think something was saved in a project, but it wasn't saved in the Tox. And then when you load the project again, all those changes get wiped out, which is another reason that I will often keep those switched off. Though sometimes for like what I call structural components, which were sort of like sections of a project, I'll keep it on, but that's a topic for another video. In addition to loading, when a project loads, or if you click this reload button, you can do this in Python. And so there's two ways to do that. One is if you set the value of this external Tox to whatever the file is that you want to load for a component, and then you pulse this reload, that will load that file onto that component. There is also this load Tox method on any component. It's worth noting, though, that this will load that Tox inside the component and not, onto it. So if we run this, then go here, like this doesn't have those parameters and the inlets, but inside it, there's now a component that does. So if you need to do the loading in place, you would do it by setting that Tox path and pulsing the reload. And if you want to load it as like a new component inside the container, then you would call this load Tox method. Now that we've gone through all the ways that you can load Tox files, let's talk a little bit more about saving them. So we already showed that you can right-click on a component and choose Save Component Tox, and it will write out that file for you. When you do that, if the file parameter is set, so, on this one, if we right-click and say Save Component Tox, it's probably going to try to Save it on top of the same, the previous file that you did, although obviously, as we've seen here, there are some kind of cases where there are bugs, but in general, it's going to treat this like you are replacing the contents of the file, because that's essentially what you're doing. But when you do that, it's not going to automatically set the contents of that parameter. So if we were to take this one, which doesn't have one set, and we save it out, click save, note that it's not updating this parameter to point to the file that we just saved. One particularly weird scenario that you can get into with this, though, is that since the path to the tox file is a parameter that can be stored in the tox file, if you save a component to a tox, even if you have that parameter set to like the right file name and everything, and then you rename that file and drag it into another project, you can end up with the component in that new project pointing to the old file that may not even exist anymore, having gotten that setting from the newly named file. All of that can kind of be a pain to remember, and worse, TouchDesigner doesn't automatically search for and save any associated tox files when you press Control S to save the project. So you can end up losing some changes with that sort of workflow. Fortunately, some wonderful folks in the TouchDesigner community have created a few tools to help with this. One of my favorites is TD Tox Saver from Pseudomagic. I will put a link to this in the description. So you can get it off of GitHub. And when you do that, you go to the releases page, you download this package zip, not the source code one. And inside that, you're going to find a couple things, but main thing is this tox file. So this, again, is another use of tox files. You can then drag this file into any project. I typically like to do that up at kind of the root of the project outside of project one. So we'll do something like that. Looks like I am slightly behind in my versions, but seems like it's probably okay. So this component from Pseudomagic has a couple settings, and mostly what it does, though, is add 2 keyboard shortcuts. When you hit the Control-W shortcut inside of the network editor, it will look at the component that is the parent of the network that you're looking at. So we're inside project 1, so it's going to look at this project 1 comp. It's going to check to see if there's a tox file already associated with it. And if not, it's going to give you a few options. You can click solo, and it will ask you to pick a folder. When you select that, it's going to save that component in a file matching that component's name in that folder. The other option will create a subfolder with that name and then put the tox inside that. In this case, we just did it as a single file without a subfolder, so it just stuck that into project1.tox. Unlike the other ways of saving tox files, this tool will automatically update that file parameter. So if we now look at the parameters of project 1, you can see that it's updated that path there. And it looks like in this case, it did an absolute path, but in most scenarios, it will do a relative one. I'm not sure quite why it did that this way. So it will already automatically link to that file as matching wherever you actually saved it. And it's also going to switch off this save backup setting by default, I think. So now that that's been set, if you're inside the same network and you hit Control-W, it's now going to notice that there is already a tox file, and it's going to ask you if you want to overwrite it. You can say yes, and it will flash the network briefly just to let you know that something's happened, and it will save out the contents of this network to that tox file. It will also, by default, add a page of parameters called about with some kind of metadata about the TouchDesigner version, when it was saved, and add this version number here. And if that page is already there and you hit the Control-W to update it, it's going to automatically increment the version and then update that save date. Personally, I don't tend to use the About page feature because I just have other ways that I prefer to keep track of that stuff. But in general, it's still a really useful feature for most people. If you don't want to use that on the component, the space save that will be loaded in, there's a setting here that you can switch off if you don't want to have it update and generate that About page. There is also another shortcut that this tool supports, which is Control-Shift-W. And this will bring up a window that's going to show you an overview of the contents of your project and anything that is linked to an external Tox file. And within that, it's going to show that version if it has that about page, as well as the date and time that it was last saved. And there's some buttons that are shortcuts for doing, for either opening that or saving it or reloading it or something. This window is a good way to keep track of which parts of the project, are linked to external files and then which haven't been saved recently. As far as I can tell, at least this version of the tool doesn't try to keep track of when components have unsaved changes. There are other tools from the community that do use that approach. Personally, I've kind of found that to be a little bit unreliable, which I don't know whether that's still accurate, but I've just been bitten too many times by assuming that something was saved and then, being wrong. So I like to try to make saving kind of like an intentional action that you're choosing to do at a particular time so that you know that it's happened. You're not just kind of hoping that something automatically picked up what you were doing in the background. Anyway, this tool is amazing. I use it in almost every project that I do, so I cannot recommend this enough. So now that we've gone through how to work with Tox files, let's talk about when not to use them. So for a project that's simple and kind of self-contained, I typically don't use them. We already talked about how you can end up losing changes if things aren't saved properly. And if you want to be able to pass that file around from computer to computer or give it to somebody else or something without having to remember to always keep, also give them the Tox file or whatever, it can be nice to just kind of have everything contained in one file. But for projects that are a little bit larger or more complex, I find that risk is kind of outweighed by the benefits, and using tools like Tox Saver helps me avoid most of the issues anyway. Another scenario is for components that are marked as clones of other components. Even if their file parameter is set, it's disabled, and just being a clone essentially replaces the rules for loading Tox components, and they're just handled with cloning instead. I covered cloning in another recent video about reusable components, so if you're curious about how that factors into things, I recommend watching that. So when is it good to use Tox files? For me, projects that are large enough to require having multiple types of files, like text or images or data or whatever, I tend to break things apart into Tox files. So I'll break out, most of the structure of a project into a whole series of files in a nested folder structure. And typically that folder structure will match, how the components are laid out, nested in the project itself. I'll also typically switch off the setting to include a backup for missing files. As I kind of mentioned earlier, in a project like that, if Tox files are missing, there's probably other stuff that's missing, and you kind of need to know that things are broken and not just silently ignore that fact and use what might be an outdated version of something that was saved in a project file you don't remember when. Splitting things into separate files is also really critical if you're going to be using Git or some other kind of version control system, and especially if you're going to be working with a team of multiple people working on the same files. That's kind of a whole other topic, which I'll probably cover in another video. If you're trying to work on a team and you're all trying to edit the same single project file, that's not going to work. So you kind of have to split things up in that case. They're also great if you're just kind of working on a small project and you notice that one particular part of it would be useful, somewhere else. You can just kind of do a one-off, save that component out to a file, drop it in when you want to add it somewhere, and you don't even necessarily have to make sure that it auto loads from the file or anything. It can just be kind of a one-time, basically a copy and paste, just dropping something into the project and then it just lives there. Doesn't necessarily have to depend on that Tox file being there. The last really important use case for Tox files is if you want to dynamically load and unload components within a project. And that could be using like an engine comp, or it could even just be in place with Python. I often use that approach for projects that have like multiple independent scenes, and it will load one in, run it, and then when it's done, unload that and swap in a different one or something, so that it's not like always having all the possible scenes that might ever play always loaded in the project. In some cases, like that can help with performance, although in others, there is also a cost to loading a tox if it's particularly large, but that's, kind of a larger topic that I'll probably cover separately. So in cases like that, I'll typically have a folder where every tox file is like a scene, and there'll be something like a folder that will scan through all of them and make like feed those into a drop down list or something. And anytime, that selection changes, it'll unload the previous one, upload the next file or whatever. So to recap, Tox files, they are great in lots of situations, but not necessarily all situations. Tox Saver is a fantastic tool, and you should definitely use it, at least for larger projects that you want to split up into separate files. This video touched a little bit on the idea of splitting projects up into a folder structure, but I plan to cover that in more detail in a separate video. Anyway, Tox files are another of those topics that might not really be like flashy, but it's really important, especially as your projects get larger and you build up a library of your work. So hopefully you found it useful. If you like this video and want to support me making more of them, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get exclusive downloads, early tutorial access, a bunch of RaidTK stuff, and other fun stuff. And even if you don't feel like paying, you can subscribe for free as a way to get RaidTK announcements and tutorial announcements and other stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching, and make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification setting.